The Book of the Duchess by Geoffrey Chaucer. Who was the king when Chaucer died? Henry IV. Which social class suffered most of the Black Death? Peasants. What was weakened by the rise of new learning? Theology. Which war lasted from 1337 to 1453? 100 Years' War. Which system began to decline during Chaucer's age? Feudalism. When was the Book of Duchess written? Between 1368 and 1372. When was the poem The Book of Duchess published? In 1532 in William Tiney's collection. What are the other titles of the poem The Book of Duchess? The Death of Blanche and the Dream of Chaucer. Why was the poem written? To commemorate the death of Blanche of Lancaster. Who was Blanche of Lancaster? The wife of John of Gaunt, Chaucer's friend and patron. What type of poem is the Book of Duchess? A dream vision, allegory. How many lines does the poem have? 1334 lines. What is the metrical pattern of the poem? Octosyllabic rhyming couplets. What type of poem is it in terms of length? A long narrative poem. Who does Lady White represent? Blanche of Lancaster. What does Long Castle symbolize? The House of Lancaster. Who is the narrator of the poem? The dreamer, Chaucer. Who does the dreamer represent? Chaucer himself. Who is says Calyx in the poem? The king. Who is Alcyone in the poem? The queen. Who is Juno in the poem? The Roman goddess. Who is Morpheus, the god of sleep? Who does Black Knight symbolize? An idealized version of John of Gaunt. Who is Lady White? A representative of Duchess Blanche. What does fortune represent in the poem? Allegorical fate or luck. Which poetic form is used in the poem? Rhyming couplets. What is the central theme of the poem? Love, loss and mourning. What classical mythology figure brings sleeps to the queen? Morpheus. What is the dreamer's role in the poem? He listens to the Black Knight's lament about Lady White. What emotion dominates the poem? Grief and sorrow. How does the Black Knight describe Lady White? As a perfect and noble lady. What does the poem ultimately symbolize? The deep personal and political grief of John of Gaunt. What caused Blanche's death? The plague. Did John of Gaunt remarry after Blanche's death? No. What does the poet do to pass time? Reads an old storybook. What story does the poet read? The story of Ceyx and Alcyone. Who are Ceyx and Alcyone? A Greek mythological couple. Why does Alcyone mourn? Her husband Ceyx has not returned from the sea. Which goddess does Alcyone pray to? Juno. Whom does Juno send to Morpheus? A messenger. Where does Morpheus travel? To the sea. What does Juno provide Alcyone? Sleep. What does Ceyx tell Alcyone in her dream? To bury him and not to worry. What does the poet wish for after reading the story? The Juno would provide him sleep. What happens to the poet while reading? He falls asleep. Where does the poet find himself in the dream? In a chamber. What does the poet do after walking in the dream? Dresses and goes for a walk. Whom does the poet meet during the walk? A knight dressed in black. How does the knight appear? Worried and sorrowful. What does the poet ask that night? The reason for his grief. What does the knight say about love? He wishes to serve love but has not found it. What happened when the knight finally fell in the love? His love was not reciprocated. What name does the knight give to his beloved? Good fair white. How does the knight describe love? As a metaphor related to the chess game. What happens at the end of the dream? The poet wakes up. What does the poet do after waking up? Writes down in his dream. Whose grief does the poem mainly portray? The Black Knight's mourning for Lady White. How is the story represented in the poem? As a dream vision. What does the dream vision symbolize? Hidden emotions. How is Lady White depicted in the poem? Beauty and virtue. What literary techniques does the poem use to represent emotions? Allegory. What does the forest symbolize in the poem? Emotional complexity. How does the poem suggest one can process grief? By sharing sorrow with others. What does Chaucer explore through the Black Knight's mourning? Love and memory. What is the significance of dream in the poem? Deeper emotional truth. Why does the poet use a dream vision format? To face in reality. What message does the poem give about love? Love, when lost, leaves an irreplaceable void. What does the Black Knight's character represent in the poem themes? Pain of losing. How do Chaucer use metaphor to convey emotions? Symbols like the forest and the hunt. What does the forest symbolize? Isolation. Why is the Black Knight important in the poem? Symbolizes deep mourning. Why is Lady White symbolism significant? Irreplaceable loss. What does the hunt symbolize? Peace in sorrow. Why does Chaucer use a dream instead of direct narration? To allow emotional exploration. What does the poem suggest about fate and loss? Fate inevitable, loss painful. Chaucer's The Book of Duchess is also known as The Death of Blanche, the Duchess. Total's Miscellany, published year is 1557. Opening title of the Dream of Chaucer, commonly referred as The Book of the Duchess. Who is the god of sleep in the Book of Duchess? Morpheus. Which of the following is a fabliau? The Miller's Tale. Dash is an indirect reference to something one would expect their audience to know. Allusion. Dash is the allegorical representation in the poem The Book of the Duchess. Fortune. And a good fairy white she hit, her white is taken to indicate Blanche. Chaucer's Book of Duchess is an elegy for Dash, Duchess of Lancaster. Identify which is the period is also known as Golden Age, Renaissance, Elizabethan, Young Age. Dash in the Book of Duchess is a physical representation of knight's sense of isolation. The forest. Who is John of Gaunt, mentioned in the Book of Duchess, fourth son of King Edward III. Identify the book of the narrator of the Book of Duchess used to help his insomnia. Ovid's Metamorphosis. The knight lost his white queen to fortune in the game of the Book of the Duchess chess game. Who are the fictional king and queen in the poem The Book of Duchess? Ceyx and Alcyone. What is painted on the walls of narrator's dream chamber in the Book of Duchess? The Romances of the Rose. How was Ceyx dead in the Book of Duchess? Drowned in a shipwreck. The Book of Duchess was written in the period of Dash, French. Chaucer's best known poem of the first period, Romaunt of the Rose. What is an ABC written by Chaucer? Prayer. Who carries Chaucer's in the House of Fame? Eagle. What is Chaucer's promise in The Legend of Good Woman? Atonement. Best legend in The Legend of Good Woman is dash. Thisbe. What is the source of the Romaunt of the Rose? Roman de la Rose. Who is the first poet buried in Westminster Abbey? Geoffrey Chaucer. The Book of